You know, it's interesting what Lisa just sang about, in some people's mind, is antithetical. The idea of trials and suffering and blessing. Because to some people, the Christian life is to avoid those things. It's to avoid suffering. It's to avoid brokenness. But the Bible and our own experience teaches that's just not reality. Not only does the Bible never promise that there is an absence of difficulty or an absence of trial in the Christian life. Matter of fact, what it tells us is that it's there and it's constant. But our own experience tells us that suffering, that difficulty, it's just a part of life. But it's in those dark times of life that God can really show Himself as glorious. It's in those dark times of life that God really shines through the brightest. And Paul is no stranger to a darkness in his life. For all the wonderful things that Paul does, for all the victories that Paul has, Paul's life is repeatedly marked by trials and by difficulties. And as last we left Paul, he was in Jerusalem, and there in the temple, he was seized by the people. They were threatening to kill him. And the Romans came in to save his life and to stop a riot. They got him, and Paul asked to address the crowd. He asked to speak, and so Paul begins to speak. And Paul talks about the fact that what he is doing and the message he is preaching, he is doing so because it came from God. And Paul says it is God who has commissioned him to take this news to the Gentiles. And it's as Paul says that, as Paul speaks that word, there is an uproar. And the crowd is done letting him talk. They will not let him speak anything else because of Paul's assertion that he is to take this news of the gospel, that the Messiah has come not just for the Jews but for the Gentiles, that he has been appointed to preach this good news. As Paul says that, the people now are done listening. They want blood. And so they cry out, and this is where we pick up in Acts chapter 22 and in verse 22. Up to this word, that is, when he speaks of the Gentiles, they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the tribune ordered him brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging to find out why they were shouting against him like this. But when they had stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? This man is a Roman citizen." So the tribune came to him and said, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he said, "Yes." And the tribune answered him, "I bought this citizenship for a large sum." Paul said, "But I am a citizen by birth." So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet, and he brought Paul down and set him before them. And looking intently at the council, Paul said, "Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day." And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by to strike him on the mouth. Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you setting to judge me according to the law? Yet, contrary to the law, you order me to be struck?" Those who stood by said, "Would you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people.'" Now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees, and it is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial." When he said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply. We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him back into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, will give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. And we are ready to kill him before he comes near." Now, the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of his centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand and going aside asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to their council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. Now they are ready, waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things." Then he called 2 of the centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor." And he wrote a letter to this effect: "Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him. Having learned that he was a Roman citizen and desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but nothing with charge deserving death or imprisonment. When it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him." So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day they journeyed to the barracks, letting the horsemen go with him. When they had come to Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor. They presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive." And he commanded them to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. So this is a scary time for Paul. I mean, the language Luke uses shows us just how dangerous things were. Notice, Luke doesn't just tell us they want to kill Paul. What is the tribute? What does he keep worrying about happening? That they would tear him apart. This is a violent crowd, apparently. They're not just wanting his death, they are wanting to humiliate him. Notice that when they send him, at the end of the chapter, when they send him to Felix, there are hundreds of soldiers with Paul. That's how afraid for his life that these people were. This is not just a little bit of trouble in Paul's life. This is not just a bad day. Paul's life is in jeopardy. Paul's very existence is threatened. Paul is not just have people there to oppose him. He has people who are violently, desperately wanting him to die. And whatever we go through in life, we come to times where things seem dark, where it seems as if there's no light, where we don't know what to do and we don't know where to turn, We are beyond our wits' end. We are broken. We are exhausted. We are tested. We are tortured. Whatever the case may be, and in the middle of all this darkness, we just don't know what to do. And Paul here is in a situation that I cannot even imagine. Paul is in a situation where he is having to be taken out by cover of darkness. His life is in constant jeopardy for nothing. For nothing. Simply because these people don't like the message that Paul is preaching. They're trying to kill him. But in this passage, the way Paul handles himself, really, I think it gives us a template for how to handle these dark times in life. And I want us to see three things that Paul did. Three things we have to remind ourselves of when we go through tough times in life. And the first is that we have to conduct ourselves in an honorable way. When times are tough, we have to conduct ourselves in an honorable way. Here's something to remember. That even though you don't have control of your circumstances, you still have control of your actions. A lot of times we go through life and things happen beyond our control. Things happen we don't like. Things happen we would never wish for, that we don't want. And when those things happen, our problem is often that we let our lack of control over our circumstances sort of permit us to have a lack of control over our actions. Things get chaotic in life, and things get troubling in life, and things happen that we don't want to happen, and so we use our circumstances to excuse our actions. Well, I've had a bad day. You come home, you're short with your wife, you're short with your kids, and what's your excuse? I've had a bad day. What are you saying? You all just need to give me space. Not that, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have acted that way. Even my bad experiences don't permit me to do this. No, we use our circumstances to excuse bad behavior. We use our circumstances to permit sin. And there's a part of us that would look at Paul, and here is Paul, and he is in prison, and these people are trying to kill him. There's a part of us that would say, you know what? He's got license to just let loose. He's got license to just tell him what he thinks, and when they accuse him of stuff, just yell back at them. But you see, Paul doesn't do that. Whenever we go through these difficult times in life, we have to keep control of our actions. We have to seek to honor God with our actions. We have to be obedient and faithful, because by seeking to honor God in my conduct, I'm asking Him to use my circumstances for His glory. If in those difficult times I say what I want to do in the way I act and in the way I conduct myself is I want to honor God. I'm not going to act how I feel. I'm not just going to do what I think will make me feel better. My desire is to honor Him. What we are doing is we're taking this difficult situation, we're taking this awful circumstance, and we're giving it over to God and saying, God, I'm going to honor You, and I'm going to trust in You to glorify Yourself in this circumstance. Question is when we go through these times, would we rather feel good? Would we rather feel like we're doing the right thing? Would we rather feel good? Would we rather feel well? Or would we rather do good? See, a lot of times we go through these circumstances and we lose control of what happens around us. We lose control of what the doctor tells us. We lose control of what happens at our job. We lose control of what happens to our bank account. We lose control of what happens with our spouse or our children. We lose control of that, and so then we just think, I'm going to try and gain control. And I'm going to gain control of my life, and it would make me feel better to do this. It would make me feel better to act this way. Somebody does something to me I don't like, and so I've lost control. I'm going to try and gain control back by saying something that'll make me feel better. I'm going to try and gain control by hurting them the way they've hurt me. And what we do in those times is we're trying to honor ourselves, and we're trying to elevate ourselves. We're trying to make ourselves feel better. And when we do that, we don't ask God, we don't let God have the freedom to use our circumstances to glorify Himself. We don't give God the freedom to take my pain and my brokenness and use it for His own glory and His Son. But what Paul does here is that Paul shows how glorious the will of God is by being obedient. Paul, he takes his circumstances and he uses them to try and glorify God. And in those, Paul is trying to do great things. Look at what happens here. Paul is standing before the crowd, and the high priest orders them to hit Paul. He orders Paul to be punched. And Paul, when he is struck, he turns to the high priest. And he says, "You whitewashed wall, how dare you do this? You're accusing me of breaking the law. You're accusing me of not living by the law. And what are you doing? You're breaking the law." You see, in Jewish law, it was presumed that you were innocent until you were proven guilty. In Jewish law, that if you had not been proven, they weren't to treat you as though you were guilty. But when the high priest orders Paul struck, he violated the law. He went against what the law was supposed to be. And Paul calls him out on it. Paul says, "You whitewashed wall." Now this language Paul uses, it's very difficult because in those days you would have all these impurity laws, right? The Jews couldn't touch certain things. They couldn't go certain places because it would make them unclean. And so they would mark certain walls that, though they had been painted, were still unclean. And Paul is basically saying to the high priest, you have this exterior that looks clean, but what it is hiding underneath of it is a dirty and unclean, a rotten character. What it's hiding is your own sinfulness. What it's hiding is your own uncleanness. And they say to Paul, "How dare you say this? How dare you speak of the high priest this way?" And you see what Paul does here? Paul says, "I didn't realize this was the high priest," and Paul apologizes. Now it's interesting what Paul doesn't do. Paul does not say, "Oh, I was wrong. I take that back." Paul doesn't say that what he said about the high priest was wrong. Paul just says he was wrong to say it. Because, and a lot of people debate why it was Paul didn't know. I don't think that this was intentional on Paul's part. I think it could have been that Paul, the reason he spoke against the high priest, remember, he hasn't been to Jerusalem for a while. Perhaps he didn't recognize the high priest. Perhaps he didn't hear where the instructions to hit him were coming from, and he didn't know it was the high priest who said it. I think the most likely thing is this is, again, closer to bad eyesight. Paul cannot hear, or Paul cannot see anything, and so I think it's very possible Paul just doesn't recognize who's saying this. He can't see very well. But what Paul does is Paul then, he says, I should not have said that, because the law says you're not to speak ill of the leaders of the people. And so what Paul is doing here is Paul is putting himself under the law. The very law he's accused of breaking, the very law he's accused of preaching against, Paul is showing that he wants to live to honor it. Even when the Roman soldiers will speak of Paul, they say, he's not done anything wrong. When Paul stands before the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Pharisees say, Paul hasn't done anything wrong. Paul says that Jesus told him to do this, and the Pharisees believed in the resurrection. The Pharisees believed in spirits. The Sadducees didn't. And the Pharisees, in essence, said, who are we to say he didn't hear from an angel? Who are we to say he didn't hear from a spirit? Luke shows us time and time again that Paul is found innocent. Nobody can charge him of anything. And when we go through these times in life, when we go through difficulties, what we need to do is we need to honor God through our conduct. We need to make sure that everything I am doing, the way I'm conducting myself, even though I may feel vindicated in doing something, even though I may have a right to do something, doesn't mean it's the right thing to do something. And so Paul wants to honor God in his conduct. He wants to make sure that in the way he conducts himself, people see his desire to obey God, and people see that he trusts in God's will, and that regardless of what's going on around him, he just wants to lift God up. He just wants to see God exalted. And so whatever we go through, we need to make sure that the way we conduct ourselves, we're trying to honor God. But the second thing we need to do is we need to remember God's continual presence. It's very interesting what happens to Paul while he is there in prison. Paul is there. Paul is awaiting sentencing. Paul is awaiting trial. People have sought to tear him apart. And in verse 11 of chapter 23, Luke says, the following night, the Lord stood by him. Do you hear that? Paul's had visions. Paul has seen visions of God, and God has spoken to Paul through visions. God has spoken to Paul in various ways. But here at Paul's darkest time, here when Paul is most in danger, God very graciously does not just provide a vision. He just doesn't speak through the stillness. It says the Lord stood by him. I think tangibly the risen Christ was with him. I think Jesus was there with Paul. In that prison cell, in the middle of all that was going on, Jesus was there with Paul. And wherever we are, we need to remember God is with us. Wherever we go in life and whatever we go through, we need to remember that God is with us. See, God's presence does not say He's going to rescue us immediately from everything we go through. God's presence is saying that He will be with us whatever we go through. And here in the middle of Paul's darkest night, Christ is with him. In Jesus' presence did several things. See, God's presence is a comfort to me. Here is Paul, and in all that's going on, in all that is happening to him, the Lord stood by him. In God's presence with me, it's a comfort to me. It assures me of His love. It assures me of His protection. It assures me of His enablement. Right? When God is with me, I am comforted. I am helped. When God is with me, I am assured that whatever I face, I'm not alone. And here, as Paul goes through all this, notice Paul is by himself. Luke doesn't mention people. Yes, Luke is there, but Paul is alone in prison. Paul is by himself, but it is God's presence that is there to comfort him. It is God's presence there to give him that assurance. But not only does God's presence, does it comfort me, God's presence strengthens me. See, Jesus says to him, take courage. Now in the Greek, what Jesus is saying here is in the perfect tense. And the perfect tense is something that happens in the present and continues on. And so when Jesus is saying take courage, Jesus isn't just saying suck it up right now. Jesus is saying you need to be courageous. Right? You need to have courage now, and you're going to continue to need to have courage. It is going to be a constant thing that you're going to take courage. And as Jesus stands by Paul and says take courage, it is God's way of saying, for as long as you need courage, for whatever you're going to need courage through, I'm going to be with you. As long as you need courage, as long as you go through this darkness, as long as your life is in jeopardy, as long as you're threatened, I'm going to be there with you. And so whatever we face, God's presence gives me courage. I love, the story of Daniel and the lion's den. There's an old African-American preacher from up in New York. His name's William Augustus Jones. And William Augustus Jones, when he preached Daniel in the lion's den, he said, Daniel didn't go into the lion's den. The lions walked into Daniel's den. And I love that. That wherever we are, we can have courage because God is with us. God is there to help us, and God is there to give us the courage that we need. Not only is God's presence a comfort to me, not only does God's presence strengthen me, God's presence sustains me. See, what Jesus does is Jesus says, as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. In essence, Jesus' presence there is guiding Paul for what's coming. He is guiding Paul for the road ahead. He is moving Paul forward. Jesus is saying that here's how I want you to go, and here's what I want you to do. He is giving Paul direction. And Jesus' presence, God's presence with us, it sustains us as we go through life. Because He guides us and He directs us, He corrects us, and He molds us more and more into the image of Christ. That as His presence is with us, He is moving us where we need to be and guiding us into His will. Right? God's presence is continually with us through the Holy Spirit. When Jesus died, He cleansed us so that God's very presence could dwell in us. God's presence is not something we have to seek. God's presence is not something we have to be worthy of. But by Jesus' death and His resurrection, He has given us the gift of His presence so that we are always with Him. You see how magnificent this is? It was in Eden that sin caused people to be cast out of the presence of God. But it's because of what Jesus has done that God's presence comes and dwells in us, so that He can comfort us and strengthen us and sustain us. And what I need to realize is that when I have God's presence, I can face anything. If we truly are yielded to the presence of God in our life, if we truly are submitted and surrendered to the presence of God in our life, we can face anything. It doesn't matter what the doctor's report is. It doesn't matter what our financial statement is. It doesn't matter what our job situation is. If I have God's presence walking through life with me, I can face anything. There is no time where I am helpless, no time where I am lost, no time where I'm unprotected. When I know I have God's presence there to comfort me and to strengthen me and to sustain me, whatever life brings to me, God is enabling me to face it so that I can honor Him through the way that I act. And so I need to remember God's continual presence. But the third thing I need to do is I need to trust in God's sovereignty. I just need to trust that God is in control. If you look at Acts, if you look here at the story of Paul, there's a part of us that wonders, why doesn't God intervene? Paul goes into the temple and everybody gathers around to seek to assault him and seek to grab him and kill him. And so God intervenes. But He only intervenes so that Paul can go to prison. And even while he's in prison, people are plotting to kill him and people are trying to destroy him. And we wonder, why doesn't God intervene? I mean, we've seen before God's rescued Paul from prison. We've seen before God's delivered Paul from death. Why doesn't God do something? See, in the middle of this difficulty, God demonstrates how He is in control of this situation. I think in all this difficulty, in all these trials, what you see, if you look for it, is the hand of God. God was in control of the circumstances. Think about it. Paul's nephew just happens to be around. He just happens to be around when these guys are plotting to kill Paul. Somebody overhears them talking about how they're going to kill Paul. And who does it just happen to be? Paul's nephew. Right place, right time. What a coincidence, right? No. Don't you see God's hand in that? Don't you see how in our circumstances, in the things that we go through, God's hand is evident, and God is using our circumstances. But here's what I want you to see too, is God isn't just at work in the circumstances. God was at work before the circumstances. Because sometimes I think we think of God, when I go through difficult times in life, we trust God's in control, but we feel like maybe He's scrambling around to fix things, and He's scrambling around to get things right and to get things in order. But think about this for a minute. The centurion says, "Come here, Paul. I don't know why they're all yelling at you. I don't know why everybody's fussing, but I'm going to beat you and we're going to find out." And as Paul begins to move there, what does Paul say? "I didn't know you could beat a Roman citizen who is unconvicted." "Well, you mean you're a Roman citizen?" "Paul, you're a Roman citizen?" And the centurion says, "I bought my citizenship." "How did you get your citizenship?" And Paul says, "By birth." Right? To have been born as a Roman citizen gave you certain rights. And part of those rights were ways that you could be punished. You had a lot of legal rights that non-citizens did not have, and those who bought their citizenship did not have. But Paul was born in Cilicia. Paul was born in a place, but you remember, we saw as a child, Paul moved to Jerusalem. That's where his family wanted to be, but it just so happened that Paul was born in Cilicia, where he was a Roman citizen. And it was his Roman citizenship that was protecting his very life here. Do you see how God's at work? How before Paul ever entered into this circumstance, God was protecting Paul by the way He ordained Paul's life and by the way that He worked in Paul's life? That the gift that He gave Paul in his citizenship was what would protect Paul here? But I also want you to see, God was not just in control in the circumstances or before the circumstances. God was in control in His inactivity. Could God have snapped His fingers and Paul just walked out of there unscathed? Absolutely, He could have. Could God have done something miraculous so that they said, "Well, Paul, I don't know why I want to let you go, but I just really feel impressed upon me to let you go. You walk right out of here." Could God have done that? Yeah. But God didn't do that. God left Paul in chains. God left Paul in prison. God left Paul under the threat of death. And God could have intervened and God could have delivered him, but God chose not to. Why, before, when Paul was in jail, did God deliver him, but not now? Why, before, when Paul was under attack, did God deliver him, but not now? See, we don't just need to say God is sovereign when He does what I want Him to do. God is not just sovereign when He works in the way that I think best serves me immediately. God is not just at work when He does what I want and He answers my prayers exactly the way He wants. God is just as in control when He says no to my prayers. God is just as in control when I don't see Him at work. You realize that Paul's imprisonment here is going to begin another 2 years of imprisonment. For 2 more years, at least Paul is going to be in prison. And God leaves him in those chains. God leaves him under the guard of these Roman soldiers. And all God has to do is speak. All God has to do is desire it. And Paul is free, and Paul walks the streets, and Paul goes to Rome, and Paul goes to these places that Paul wanted to go. But God in His sovereignty, God in His control of the situation as He rules and reigns, leaves Paul imprisoned. And God is just as in control when God heals somebody of cancer temporarily in this life as when God lets them die and He heals them eternally. God is just as in control when He rescues somebody's job at the 11th hour as when they lose their job. And I need to stop trying to gauge God's control of life by whether or not He does what I want Him to do and He acts the way I think He should. And what I need to realize is however God is acting, even when I don't see it, is His exercise of His control, and it is His expression of His goodness. And so Paul, even though he remains in chains, he is protected by God. And God's in control. And what I have to do is, instead of focusing on what we think God is not doing, we need to watch for the ways in which God displays His goodness. It is our tendency to look at what we think God is not doing. It is our tendency for our attention to be drawn to what we think God should do. If God was really in control, He would do this. If God was really in control, He'd give me a job. If God was really in control, He'd give me a husband. If God was really in control, my kids would be good. If God was really in control, I would be healed. And we look for all these ways that we think God should express His sovereignty. And what we are doing is we are wanting God to enable our sovereignty. We want to be in control, and we just want God to supply the power for our control. But that is not how God works. What we need to do is we need to look for those times in our life, even when it seems as if God is absent. We need to see the ways in which He works, because if we just look, we will see countless ways in which God is working in our circumstances, or before our circumstances, or even being silent for our good. I'll never forget the day that when Sarah was pregnant, and our OB, who had been practicing for over 30 years, he had taught at the University of North Carolina, he had taught at the University of Kentucky. He was a brilliant man, very gifted. He came to me and he said, "Michael, I just don't know what to do." Between week 6 and week 12 of her pregnancy, Sarah had lost 35 pounds. They had tried every medicine. She literally had 2 pumps pumping 2 different kinds of anti-nausea medicine into her body 24 hours a day. And it still wasn't enough. She couldn't eat anything. And he came in and he said, "I don't know what to do." Those are scary words for a husband to hear. Those are scary words for a father to hear. And so we're going to transfer her over to the University of Kentucky Hospital. So they order the transfer. And then a tornado warning comes. We had to wheel her. We were supposed to wheel her out into the hallway of the hospital, and I told the nurse, "That ain't happening. She's going to stay in here, and if God chooses to take us by tornado, that's fine." But she's in no condition to go out there. Sarah remembers none of this. Finally, after hours, an ambulance comes. They take her. And as I was walking, or as I was driving over to the hospital behind the ambulance, I was talking to my dad on the phone, and Dad said, "Hey, the head of the obstetrics department at the University of Kentucky visited Buck Run this past Sunday. And I just gave him a call, and he's going to be waiting there with a team of his doctors for you to ask them questions, and they're going to look over Sarah." Now, on one hand, I could look and I could say, "God, what's happening? God, why is all this happening?" But God was at work there. And you're telling me it just happened that the head of the obstetrics department visited my dad's church the Sunday before my wife was going to be taken to his hospital? And we came there, and there was a team of doctors of all these different disciplines waiting in her hospital room just to talk to her and look at her and look over her charts. And it's what saved her life, and it's what saved Henry's life. And the road was still hard, and the road was still long ahead. But that just was God's way of saying, "You may not see everything I'm doing, and you may not see every way I'm working, but I've got this. I'm in control here." And if we look past those times where we don't see God at work, and God isn't doing what we expect Him to do, and we just look to see what He does, It is a great comfort to us that a God who created all things, a God who is infinitely holy, a God who is perfectly good, a God who is totally sovereign, that He surrenders to our, He condescends to our circumstances. And He cares about the things that we go through. And even in small areas, He shows His mighty hand in great ways. And we see it if we will just stop focusing on our plan and let God be God. And here is Paul. And Paul could cry out and Paul could say, God, what are you doing? But Paul keeps praising. Paul keeps worshiping because Paul realized his life is not his own. His life is as God shows in Jeremiah, we are but clay in the hands of a potter. You know, it's an interesting thing about clay. Because clay has these microscopic crystals in it that even a light microscope can't see. And when they have pressure applied to them, those crystals, they don't diminish and they don't shrink. They actually grow. And those crystals become clay. Or those clay crystals become slate. But the more pressure that's applied to them, those crystals become a gem. And what makes a gem beautiful is its reflection. And in those times of life where we have all this pressure applied to us, in those times of life when life bears down on us and our circumstances and our trials keep applying pressure, it is in those times that God is turning clay into a gem so that it can reflect Him. It's in those times that as pressure is applied to us, but we say, I want to honor God through my conduct, and then I want to remember that He is with me, and so I want to honor Him knowing that He will enable me to honor Him, and I'm going to trust in His plan, even though I don't see it, even though I don't know what He's doing. The more that pressure is applied, the more we are reflecting the goodness of our Creator, the more we are reflecting the holiness of our God, the more we are reflecting our Savior, who when pressure was applied to Him, when trials faced Him, He did nothing but be obedient. And though we don't see it, what God is doing through these dark nights of life is that God is reflecting the love and God is reflecting the glory of His Son who suffered on my behalf. Because whatever I go through in life is nothing compared to what Jesus suffered. Whatever I go through in life is me suffering for me, but what Jesus went through was Jesus suffering for my sake and for your sake. It was Jesus suffering for my sin and for your sin. And it was in His suffering that as He was obedient, that God brought my salvation and your salvation. And it is through my suffering that God reflects Himself to a world around me. It's as I suffer that people see my faith in God and people see how faithful God is. It's as I honor God, people see how perfect His Word is. It's as I honor God, people see how comforting and how continual His presence is. It's as I honor God, people see how perfect His plan for my life is. And just as we, some 2,000 years later, are reading and being encouraged by what God did in the life of Paul through his suffering, as Paul mirrored the suffering of Jesus Christ, so we have that opportunity to show the goodness of God and the perfection of our Savior as we suffer for His sake. As whatever it is that causes these dark nights, as whatever it is God brings into your life, as we say, my life is not my own, I am clay being molded and shaped by my Creator, that God uses that to bring glory to His name and to honor Him. And may that be our goal in whatever we go through in life. Let's bow our heads. If you're here this morning, maybe you're going through a tough time, or maybe you've just come through a tough time. Maybe you see a tough time on the horizon. It's part of life. And we can either let our circumstances control us, or through the strength God provides, we can seek to use our circumstances for His glory. And if you're here this morning and you've put your faith in Jesus Christ, there is nothing more you need to get through those dark times of life than obedience. There's nothing you lack. God has given you His Son. God has given you everything you need. We just need to be obedient to Him, to trust in Him, to love Him enough to obey Him and follow Him in those times. But maybe you're going through a tough time this morning. And part of the reason it's so tough is because you feel alone in it. There's nobody walking through that tough time with you because you've never put your faith in Jesus Christ. You've got friends, you've got family, but they don't know how dark things are. They don't know how bad things are, and they really can't even help. So God sent His Son to experience the greatest darkness of all. Matter of fact, when Jesus died, God showed visibly just how dark it was, that in the middle of the day, the sky was black. And the wrath of God was poured out on Jesus. The one who never sinned, the one who always followed God's will perfectly, so that we could have a relationship with God. He took our punishment so that He could give us His righteousness. We serve a God who knows what suffering is. We serve a God who has taken away the greatest suffering we could ever face if we would just trust in Him. And we serve a God who promises that whatever suffering we face, to go there with us. Just as Paul felt the presence of God as he went through suffering. God can give you His presence to walk through life with you. And so, this morning, as we have our invitation, I don't know how God leads, whether He is calling you to put your faith in Him, to trust in Him so that you can take that burden of life and let Him lift it off of you. Maybe you are going through a time of difficulty, a time of suffering, a time of trial, and you know that you've trusted in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, but you haven't accepted the freedom that He offers by simply trusting in Him. You're trying to control things, and you're trying to do life the way you want it. And so it keeps getting more complicated, and it keeps getting more difficult. And instead of letting God be God, you keep trying to be in control. And this morning you just need to say, God, I'm just going to trust in You. Maybe you're here this morning and you want to partner with our church as we encourage one another and strengthen one another. As we go through life together to honor God and fulfill His mission. And as brothers and sisters, we sharpen one another and stir one another up to good works. It says in the book of Hebrews, so that we can best serve God and live for Him. However God leads, all we need to do is follow. Father, Lord, I pray for anyone here this morning who's going through difficulty. I pray for anyone here this morning who feels alone in their difficulty. Father, I pray that they would see that You love them so much, that You offer them Your presence. And all they have to do to receive it's not be good enough or worthy enough. They just have to trust in what Jesus has already done. Father, I pray for believers that we would just trust You with our difficulty, that whatever we go through, instead of us trying to control our circumstances and eventually our circumstances controlling us, that we just trust in You. And it frees us up to worship, and it frees us up to obey, because instead of trying to control what we can't control, Father, we just focus on the things that we can do, and that is worship You and follow You. Lord, may we be a people who, whatever happens to us, we live our lives honorably, that we pursue holiness with our lives, that, Father, we always remember Your presence, that we don't try and go through life in our own strength, but that we trust in your presence and we rely on you. And Father, may we trust in your sovereignty. May we trust in your plan, and even when we don't understand it and we don't see it, may we simply trust in who you are. And if you love us so much that you sent your Son to die for us and to take the punishment for our sin, to give us His righteousness, Father, if you love us that much, you love us enough to get us through whatever life brings. You love us enough to never leave us alone. You love us enough to never forsake us. You love us enough to always fulfill your promises to us. And may we simply trust in that. Father, however it is that you lead, may we follow. And it's in the name of Christ we pray.